Imagine walking into a place that feels entirely your own, a sanctuary where the air is perfectly crisp and the only sounds are the gentle rustling of leaves and the soft babbling of a nearby stream. For an 18-year-old girl named Bella, this place was a hidden forest tucked away in the majestic mountains of France. It was June of 2019, and Bella had just finished her very first year of college. Like any student wrapping up a hectic year of exams and dorm life, she was absolutely exhausted and looking forward to a summer of peace and quiet. Her family lived on the outskirts of a small, quiet town that was virtually swallowed by this massive, dense forest. Growing up, Bella had spent countless hours exploring these woods. Sometimes she went with her father, other times with her siblings, but most of the time, she preferred to go alone. She knew the layout of these woods like the back of her hand, and she felt completely safe under the canopy of those ancient trees. Her absolute favorite spot in the entire forest was a beautiful, man-made lake that sat right in the heart of the woods. It was not a massive body of water, but it offered a stunning, panoramic view of the surrounding mountains, and it was always incredibly quiet. To get there, Bella had developed a very specific routine. She would leave her house, hop into her car, and drive a couple of miles down a winding mountain road. Then she would pull off onto a small, unmarked shoulder. There was no sign indicating that this was the trailhead to the lake. In fact, to anyone else driving by, it just looked like a random patch of dirt right next to the thick forest. But Bella and her family had discovered years ago that if you entered the woods at this exact spot and pushed through a short stretch of thick, tangled underbrush, you would quickly find yourself in a small, beautiful clearing. Just ahead of this clearing was a tiny, clear stream. Running parallel to the left side of this stream was a narrow, dirt path. It was not a human trail, but rather an animal path carved out over decades by deer and other local wildlife. Bella would step onto this animal path and walk alongside the stream for about 15 or 20 minutes. She would follow it until the path made a very sharp, sudden turn to the left, veering deep into the thick forest and away from the water. At this exact point, Bella would step off the animal trail and continue walking directly along the stream. She would step carefully from rock to rock, sometimes walking on the narrow banks when the ground allowed it. She would follow this stream due north, heading deeper and deeper into the quiet forest for about an hour at a very leisurely pace. Eventually, this stream would connect with a much larger river that ran from east to west. When she reached this river, Bella would turn left, facing west, and walk along the riverbank for another 20 minutes until the river finally fed into the beautiful man-made lake. Once she arrived, Bella would find a large flat rock near the water's edge, sit down, and just take in the scenery. She would watch the birds, listen to the water gently lapping against the shore, and just completely decompress. When she was done, she would retrace her steps, taking the exact same 2-hour journey back to her parked car. One of the reasons Bella loved this lake so much was because, up until the summer of 2019, she had never seen another human being out there. The only people she had ever encountered in this forest were her own family members. It truly felt like her own private paradise. So, almost immediately after returning home from college in June of 2019, Bella decided she needed to visit her happy place. It had been months since she had been to the lake, and she was practically itching to get back out there. One morning, she woke up early, packed a small bag, hopped in her car, and drove to her secret pull-off. She parked, stepped out of her car, and walked straight into the thick trees. She found the stream, stepped onto the animal path, and began her familiar walk. Everything felt completely normal and peaceful. The air was cool, the sun was filtering through the trees, and she was feeling incredibly relaxed. After walking for about 15 minutes, she reached the point where the animal trail veered off to the left, and she stepped into the stream bed to continue heading north. She walked for another 30 minutes, navigating the slippery rocks and listening to the water. At this point, she was still about a mile or two away from the east to west running river when she suddenly froze. Somewhere far off in the distance, directly ahead of her in the deep woods, she heard a sound. It was a single, clear chime. It sounded exactly like a bell. Bella stood perfectly still, her heart skipping a beat. There were never any people out here, so hearing a man-made sound like a bell was highly unusual. She listened closely, wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her, or if maybe she had just heard a bird call that sounded like a chime. But then, the sound started up again. This time, it was not just a single chime. It was a continuous, sporadic ringing. It was not a steady, rhythmic ringing like a church bell. Instead, it was completely random and chaotic, as if someone was holding a bell and shaking it vigorously, the way someone might ring a cowbell at a sporting event. Bella stood there, completely puzzled. She started running through logical explanations in her head. She wondered if maybe a dog had gotten lost in the woods, and it had a bell attached to its collar. But as she listened, she realized the sound was far too loud and robust to be a tiny bell on a pet's collar. Then she wondered if someone had lost a box containing a bell, and it had somehow ended up in the river and was now banging against the rocks as it floated downstream. It was a bizarre theory, but she was not really scared. She was mostly just intrigued and curious. Since the sound was coming from the exact direction she was already heading, she figured she would just keep walking and eventually see what was causing it. She continued north along the stream, keeping her ears open. But after about 5 minutes of walking, the sporadic ringing suddenly stopped. The forest went completely silent. This sudden silence actually startled Bella more than the ringing itself, because she had been focusing on it so intently. She stopped again, holding her breath, waiting for the sound to resume, but it didn't. The only thing she could hear was the gentle flow of the stream and the wind rustling through the high branches. Bella shrugged, assuming there was a perfectly logical explanation for it, and decided to put it out of her mind. She focused back on her destination and kept walking. About 15 minutes later, she was still making her way along the stream, about a half-mile away from the river, when she noticed something up ahead on the left bank. There was a dark shape lying on the ground. At first, she thought it was just a large rock or perhaps a fallen log. But as she got closer, she realized it was the body of an animal. Specifically, it was a beaver. Bella stepped closer to get a better look, and when she did, she felt a wave of nausea hit her. The beaver was missing its head. Now, Bella was an experienced outdoorswoman, and she knew that wild animals died in the forest all the time. Finding a dead animal that had been killed by a predator was not unusual, but as she looked at this beaver, she realized something was deeply wrong. The cut on the beaver's neck was unbelievably neat and uniform. It did not look like it had been torn apart by the teeth of a wolf or a wild dog. It looked like its head had been cleanly and precisely severed with an incredibly sharp knife. Furthermore, the beaver's head was nowhere to be found, and the rest of its body was completely intact. If a predator had killed it, they would have eaten it. But this animal had simply been decapitated and left there. As Bella stood over the carcass, she noticed another detail. There was absolutely no smell of decomposition. In the summer heat, a dead animal begins to smell very quickly. The lack of odor meant this beaver had been killed very recently. Bella gently prodded the body with the toe of her boot, and she felt that the limbs were still completely limp. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of the muscles that occurs shortly after death, had not set in yet. This meant the beaver had been killed within the last few hours, if not the last few minutes. Suddenly, a cold dread washed over Bella. She realized that whatever or whoever had decapitated this beaver was likely still in the immediate area, and then she made the connection. The strange, sporadic bell she had heard earlier had come from this exact direction. It was no longer a curious mystery. It felt incredibly sinister. Bella quickly looked around, whipping her head from side to side, scanning the thick trees and the dark underbrush. She half expected to see a hunter or a stranger standing in the shadows watching her. But the forest was completely still. She forced herself to take a deep breath. She told herself to calm down, that she was letting her imagination run wild. It was broad daylight. She had been coming to these woods for years, and nothing bad had ever happened to her. She stepped over the beaver carcass and continued on her way to the lake. She reached the river, turned left, and walked the final 20 minutes to her favorite spot. She sat on the flat rock, enjoyed the beautiful view, and tried to forget about the headless beaver and the strange bell. Eventually, she turned around, walked past the carcass on the ground, and made it back to her car safely. A week passed, and Bella was sitting around her house on a boring afternoon. She was feeling restless, and she decided quite abruptly that she wanted to go back to the man-made lake. She told her parents where she was going, hopped in her car, and drove to the shoulder of the road. She parked and entered the forest at exactly 6 o'clock in the evening. She knew that sunset was at 9 o'clock, which gave her exactly 3 hours of daylight. It was going to be a tight squeeze, and she knew she would have to walk quickly to avoid being caught in the woods after dark, but she was confident she could manage it. As she started her walk along the stream, she heard the distant, low rumble of thunder. She looked up through the thick canopy of trees and saw that the sky was starting to turn a dark, bruised purple. A storm was clearly rolling in. Most people would have turned around right then and there, but Bella was determined. She had a stubborn streak, and she really wanted to reach the lake. Instead of heading back to her car, she decided to speed up. She began to jog along the rocky edge of the stream, hoping to beat the weather. Almost immediately, the first heavy raindrops began to fall. By the time she jogged past the headless beaver carcass, which was still lying on the bank exactly where she had left it, the rain was coming down in sheets. By the time she reached the junction where the stream met the east-to-west river, it was a torrential downpour. Bella turned left and started walking along the riverbank, but after just a minute or two, she stopped. She looked down at her watch and saw that it was already past 8 o'clock. She stood there, completely soaked, shivering from the cold rain, and did some quick math. It was going to take her over an hour to walk back to her car. The sun was going to set in less than an hour, and with the heavy storm clouds blocking out the remaining light, it was already getting incredibly dark. If she continued all the way to the lake, she would be navigating this dense forest in complete pitch-black darkness for a long time. She knew she was experienced, but being lost in a torrential storm in the dark was a recipe for disaster. She sighed, admitted defeat, and turned around to head back. As she walked south along the stream, the visibility became incredibly poor. The rain was pounding against her face, and the twilight was rapidly fading. Bella kept her head down, focusing entirely on her feet. She did not want to slip on a wet rock or trip over a tree root and break her ankle. She walked like this for about 15 minutes, her world reduced to the small circle of ground right in front of her. Suddenly, without warning, something solid smacked her right in the top of her head. Bella gasped, instinctively throwing her hands up to protect her face, and stumbled backward. She looked up to see what she had run into, and she instantly felt her stomach drop. Hanging from a thick tree branch directly over the stream was the headless beaver carcass. But it had been altered. Someone had retrieved the severed head, and using a thick black thread, they had crudely stitched the head onto the beaver's front paws, making it look as though the dead animal was holding its own head. Bella stared at the dangling, wet carcass, and she began to gag. She was completely horrified and disgusted. She frantically began rubbing her hair and her forehead, terrified that the decomposing juices of the animal had gotten onto her skin. But as she stood there, frantically wiping her face, a much more terrifying realization dawned on her. When she had walked past this exact spot just 30 minutes earlier on her way into the woods, the beaver carcass was still lying on the ground. She had seen it with her own eyes. That meant that in the short 30-minute window since she had passed by, someone had picked up the heavy carcass, climbed this tree, stitched the head to its paws, and hung it from the branch directly over the path. And that meant whoever did this was still out here, right now, in the pitch-black woods, in the middle of a torrential downpour. Bella felt a wave of pure, primal panic wash over her. She looked around, but she could see absolutely nothing. The forest was shrouded in total darkness, the trees forming terrifying, jagged shapes against the night sky. The only sound was the deafening roar of the rain. She was at least an hour's walk away from her car. Even if she ran, she forced herself to think. She knew that if she started sprinting in the dark, she would likely fall, hurt herself, and be completely helpless. She had to stay calm and walk as fast as she could. She carefully navigated around the dangling beaver and began to fast walk along the stream. But the moment she passed the carcass, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She felt with absolute certainty that she was being watched, and then she heard it. Through the sound of the pouring rain, she heard the distinct snap of a branch behind her. Bella could not help herself. She started to walk faster, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept telling herself that it was just an animal, a deer or a wild boar startled by her presence. But she was too terrified to turn around and look. Her fast walk quickly turned into a jog, and then, before she even realized what she was doing, she was sprinting. She was running as fast as her legs could carry her, stumbling over rocks, splashing through deep puddles, and desperately trying to keep her balance in the dark. She ran for about 5 minutes until her lungs felt like they were on fire. She was completely out of breath and she had to slow down to a walk. She stopped for a brief second to catch her breath, her chest heaving. She still had not turned around, and then, out of the darkness behind her, she heard the bell. It was the exact same sound she had heard the week before, that chaotic, sporadic, violent ringing of a bell. But this time, it was not far off in the distance. It sounded incredibly close. Somewhere in the thick trees just behind her, Bella lost all control. The terror completely consumed her. She pulled her iPhone out of her pocket, and with trembling, wet fingers, she dialed her father's number. She put the phone to her ear, sobbing and gasping for air as she began to run again. Her father answered the phone, and before he could even say hello, Bella was wailing into the receiver. She could barely form words, but she managed to scream that someone was chasing her in the woods, that they had hung the beaver, and that she was terrified. She begged him to come to the forest and meet her at the spot where the animal trail veered away from the stream. Her father did not ask any questions. He could hear the absolute, primal terror in his daughter's voice, and he knew she was in mortal danger. He told her to stay on the line and that he was coming right now. Bella's mother and father ran out of their house, hopped into their car, and sped down the winding mountain road. They pulled up next to Bella's parked car, left their headlights on, and ran straight into the dark woods. As they pushed through the wet branches, they could hear the frantic cries of their daughter through the phone. And then they heard something else. Through the phone, and echoing faintly through the actual trees in the distance, they heard the sound of a bell ringing. Bella was running on pure adrenaline now, but her body was rapidly failing her. She had been running for what felt like an eternity, and her legs were shaking with exhaustion. The sporadic sound of the bell was getting louder and louder, closer and closer. She could hear the heavy thud of footsteps behind her, crashing through the brush, snapping branches. Whatever was chasing her was gaining on her fast. Finally, when it felt like the bell was right on top of her, Bella realized she could not run anymore. Her body simply gave out. She came to a halt in a small, natural clearing in the forest. Because it was a clearing, there were no tree branches overhead to block the sky, and the pale moonlight managed to filter through the rain clouds, illuminating a space about 50 feet wide. Terrified beyond words, Bella slowly turned around to face her pursuer. For a moment, she saw nothing but the dark wall of the forest. And then, a tall, dark figure walked out of the trees and into the clearing. As it stepped into the faint moonlight, Bella could see that the figure was incredibly tall. Around its waist, it had a large bell. With every single step the figure took, it would violently shake its hips, causing the bell to ring out in that chaotic, sporadic pattern. Bella stood frozen, her mind completely unable to process what she was looking at. In the pale light, the figure's movements did not look human. The way it walked was incredibly awkward and abnormal, as if its limbs were not jointed correctly, or as if it was a massive animal trying to walk on two legs. It was the most unnatural, terrifying thing she had ever seen. The figure began to move directly toward her, accelerating its strange, disjointed pace. The bell at its waist clanged wildly. This sight triggered a final desperate surge of adrenaline in Bella. She turned and began to sprint faster than she had ever run in her life. She screamed out at the top of her lungs, lying to the dark woods, shouting that she was on the phone with the police and they were waiting for her just ahead. But the figure did not slow down. It kept charging after her, the clanging of the bell getting closer and closer. A few hundred yards ahead, Bella's father was charging through the woods. He could hear his daughter's screams echoing through the dark, and he ran toward them with reckless abandon. Suddenly, he saw a flash of light color through the trees. It was Bella. She came bounding out of the brush and literally threw herself into her father's arms. Her father grabbed her, turned around, and ran back toward the trailhead where his wife was waiting. The three of them scrambled out of the woods, piled into their car, and locked the doors. They did not look back. They sped away, leaving the dark forest behind them. Inside the car, the entire family was in tears, completely hysterical. Bella was sobbing uncontrollably, unable to explain what she had just seen. Her parents were pale and shaking, repeating over and over again that they had heard the bell. The sound of that bell in the dark woods had confirmed their worst fears. There really was something out there. They drove straight to the local police station, where Bella, still shivering and covered in mud, filed a detailed report. Afterward, her parents took her to the emergency room to be examined. Aside from some severe scrapes, bruises, and deep emotional shock, she was physically unharmed. The very next morning, a large group of police officers went out to the forest to investigate. They walked the animal trail and searched the banks of the stream, looking for any sign of the tall figure or the person who had chased Bella. But they found absolutely nothing. Bella told them she had dropped her handbag during the chase, and she described the exact spot where she believed it had fallen. But when the police reached that area, the handbag was gone. They also went to the branch where the stitched beaver had been hanging, but the branch was empty. The beaver carcass was gone, and there was no sign of it on the ground either. The only unusual thing the police found during their search was located a short distance away from the stream, right along the path Bella had run. Tucked neatly underneath a heavy rock was a clean, folded t-shirt. The police had no idea what it meant, and Bella had never seen it before. Ultimately, the police told the family that Bella had likely run into a mentally unstable transient who was living illegally in the woods. They suggested that this person felt Bella was trespassing on their territory and had decided to play a series of sick, elaborate mind games to scare her off. But Bella has never been able to accept that explanation. When she thinks back to that night and the moment she turned around in the clearing, she remembers the way that figure moved. It was not the movement of a human being. It was something entirely different, something deeply wrong. Since that night in June of 2019, there have been no more reports of a strange figure or a ringing bell in those woods. But then again, almost nobody ever goes into that part of the forest except for Bella and her family, and they have never gone back. Whatever is out there in the dark, rainy woods of France, is still out there, waiting in the silence. Now, we are going to travel across the Atlantic Ocean to the desolate deserts of Nevada, where another explorer would capture something on camera that defied all logical explanation. In the summer of 2013, a middle-aged man named Frank pulled his car into the tiny isolated town of Kingston, Nevada. To call Kingston a town is a bit of an understatement. It is a microscopic community home to fewer than 100 year-round residents. It is so small, so cut off from the rest of civilization, that it does not even have a single stoplight. The town is basically just a handful of dusty buildings, including a small laundromat and a local saloon, sandwiched between a massive, rugged mountain range on one side and miles of empty, baking desert on the other. In 2013, there were really only two reasons why anyone would ever find themselves in Kingston. The first reason was if you lived there, or if you were visiting one of the few people who did. The second reason was if you were an explorer interested in visiting the historic, abandoned mines scattered throughout the nearby mountains. Frank was in Kingston for the latter. For the previous 5 years, Frank had made it his life's passion to travel all over Nevada, California, and the wider West Coast, searching for abandoned, historic mines. He would pack up his hiking gear, locate these forgotten tunnels, and walk inside with a video camera. He would film his explorations, and when he returned home, he would upload the raw footage to his personal YouTube channel. By the time he arrived in Kingston, Frank had uploaded an incredible 302 videos to his channel. but despite this massive library of content, his channel was very small. He had very few subscribers, and his videos rarely got more than a handful of views. This made it clear that Frank was not doing this for internet fame or money. He was doing it out of a pure, genuine passion for history and exploration. He loved the thrill of stepping into places that had been locked away in darkness for decades, and he wanted to share that thrill with the few people who cared to watch. When you look back at those first 302 videos, Frank's passion and expertise really shine through. He was not just a tourist wandering into holes in the ground. He always researched the history of the mines before he visited them. When he was inside, if he came across old machinery, rotting timber, or rusted equipment, he immediately knew what they were. He would speak about them with a high level of sophistication, using specific mining lingo that showed he understood the mechanics of these operations on a very granular level. So, when Frank arrived in Kingston, he was planning to do exactly what he had always done. He was going to hike up the mountain, explore a couple of interesting historic mines, film the experience, and upload it for his small group of loyal followers. He had no idea that this trip would be cut short by something so deeply disturbing that it would change his life forever. The two specific mines Frank wanted to visit on this trip were the Victorine Mine and the Horton Mine. The history of these two operations is actually very interesting and closely linked. The Horton Mine was built first, somewhere around the late 1970s or early 1980s. The mining company constructed it in hopes of striking a rich vein of gold, but after digging deep into the mountain, they found absolutely nothing. It was a complete bust. However, the company did not give up. They went about 900 feet higher up the mountain, directly above the entrance of the Horton Mine, and they began digging a second tunnel. This second tunnel was called the Victorine Mine, and in the Victorine Mine, they hit the jackpot. They found a massive deposit of gold, but this presented a major logistical problem. The Victorine Mine was high up on a steep, rugged cliffside. It was incredibly difficult and expensive to transport the heavy gold ore down the steep mountain path to the valley below where it could be processed. So, the engineers came up with a brilliant, highly unusual solution. Directly outside the entrance of the Victorine Mine, they drilled a massive, vertical hole straight down through the solid rock of the mountain. This hole went down 900 feet, and it connected directly into the ceiling of the Horton Mine below. They had essentially built a giant, vertical laundry chute inside the mountain. Instead of carrying the heavy ore down the mountain, the miners at the Victorine Mine would simply dump the raw rock down this vertical chute. It would freefall 900 feet and land directly inside the Horton Mine. To handle the falling rock, the company built a massive, heavy-duty conveyor belt system inside the Horton Mine. When the ore hit the bottom of the chute, it would land on the conveyor belt, which would transport it all the way out of the lower tunnel to the surface, where trucks were waiting to take it to town. This system worked beautifully for several years, but by 1989, the gold in the Victorine Mine had completely run out. The company permanently shut down both operations, boarded up the entrances, and walked away, leaving the massive chute and the conveyor belt system to rot in the darkness. These two mines were located about 4 miles west of the Kingston town center. To get there, Frank drove his car along a dirt access road that headed straight toward the looming mountains. After about 4 miles, the road ended at a sharp right turn that climbed steeply up the rugged terrain. At this point, the road was no longer passable for a standard vehicle. It was just a narrow, rocky hiking trail. Frank parked his car, grabbed his video camera strapped on his heavy backpack, and began the long, steep climb up the mountain. As he hiked, he passed a couple of dilapidated, overgrown wooden cabins. These cabins had been built decades earlier to house the miners who worked the site, but now they were completely abandoned, their roofs caving in and wild weeds growing through the floorboards. Passing these cabins meant Frank was very close to the mine entrances. He eventually reached the Victorine Mine first. The entrance was easy to spot because right outside was a massive rusted steel structure that looked like heavy scaffolding. This was the top opening of the 900-foot vertical chute. Frank looked around the Victorine site, but for some reason, he either chose not to film inside this upper mine, or he simply never uploaded the footage. The video that Frank would eventually upload begins with his camera already rolling as he walks down the steep path from the Victorine Mine to the entrance of the Horton Mine below. When the camera focuses on the entrance of the Horton Mine, it is immediately clear that this is an incredibly creepy, foreboding place. The entrance is massive, about 20 feet tall, and the rock surrounding it is incredibly unstable. To prevent the entire mountainside from collapsing and sealing the entrance, the mining company had anchored dozens of long, heavy copper plates all around the opening. These plates had tarnished over the years, giving the entrance a strange, metallic, rib-like appearance, almost like the gaping mouth of some giant subterranean beast. Because the mine was abandoned and highly dangerous, a large, metal warning gate had been erected directly in front of the entrance, bearing bold signs warning people to keep out. But Frank, being an experienced explorer, was completely unfazed by the warnings. He walked right up to the gate, pointed his camera at the dark tunnel ahead, and began talking about the history of the mine in his trademark calm, informative voice. Then he casually stepped over the warning gate and walked into the pitch-black tunnel. Almost immediately, Frank noticed a potential hazard. The ground at the entrance of the mine was covered in several inches of water. In his video, Frank pauses and addresses this on camera. He says that he is not planning to go very far into this particular mine because of the water. His concern was not about getting his boots wet. As an experienced miner explorer, Frank knew that standing water in an abandoned mine is extremely dangerous. Over decades of abandonment, highly toxic, lethal gases can pool inside these tunnels. When water sits stagnant in a cave, these heavy gases can actually dissolve into the water. If an explorer steps into the water and agitates it, it can release a concentrated cloud of poisonous gas, known as bad air, which can cause someone to lose consciousness and die within seconds. But as Frank was standing there debating whether he should turn around, he pointed his flashlight at the wet ground near the left wall of the entrance. There, clearly pressed into the mud, was a fresh set of human footprints. Someone had walked into this mine very recently. Seeing these footprints gave Frank a sense of security. He figured that if someone else had walked in here and made it out alive, the air quality was likely fine. He decided he would go just a little bit further into the tunnel, making sure to step carefully and avoid agitating any deep pools of water. Frank walked about 10 feet deeper into the darkness, and then he raised his camera to look down the main shaft of the mine. The view was incredibly eerie. Hanging from the high, arched ceiling was a long, collapsed, yellow plastic tube. This was the remnant of the old ventilation system that used to pump fresh air to the miners. As he walked another 10 feet, he saw that the ceiling was also draped in dozens of heavy, rusted metal chains. These chains were dangling straight down from the rock overhead, and they seemed to stretch as far into the darkness as the eye could see. These were the chains that had once held up the massive conveyor belt system that transported the gold ore from the 900-foot vertical chute. Even though Frank had been inside hundreds of mines and had seen similar setups, he was clearly unsettled by the atmosphere in the Horton mine. He turned the camera toward himself and admitted that there was something deeply off about this place. He said the mine was incredibly sketchy and was giving him a really bad vibe. He later wrote that as he stood in that dark tunnel, surrounded by the dripping water and the rustling chains, he felt an overwhelming sensation that he was not alone. It felt as though someone or something was standing just out of view in the darkness, staring at him. But then, Frank noticed something that seemed to contradict his fears. He looked down at the water on the ground and realized it was not stagnant after all. It was actually a small, active stream of running water flowing gently toward the entrance of the mine. Because the water was moving, the risk of trapped, lethal gases was virtually non-existent. The air in the mine was perfectly safe to breathe. Frank stood there for a moment, weighing his options. On one hand, the mine was physically safe to explore. On the other hand, he had an intense, instinctual feeling of dread. Ultimately, his curiosity won. He decided he would go just a little bit further to see if he could find the bottom of the 900-foot vertical chute. He walked deeper into the tunnel, his flashlight beam cutting through the damp air until he was about 100 feet inside. At this point, the entrance of the mine was just a small, bright arch of daylight far behind him. Frank turned around to capture a shot of the entrance to show his viewers how far he had traveled. Then, he turned back to face the dark depths of the mine. He raised his flashlight, shining the beam down the long, straight tunnel, aiming it at the dangling chains, and then his flashlight beam landed on a chain about 50 feet ahead of him. While every other chain in the mine was hanging perfectly still, this one single chain was swinging. It was not just gently swaying from a draft. It was swinging violently back and forth, cutting a wide arc through the dark air, as if someone had just grabbed it, yanked it hard, and let it go. Frank froze. The camera began to tremble in his hand. He zoomed the lens in on the swinging chain, his mind desperately searching for a rational explanation. There was no wind in the mine, and even if there was a slight draft, it would have caused all the light chains to sway. But this was a heavy, rusted iron chain, and it was the only one moving. Frank stood in absolute dead silence for several seconds, staring at the swinging metal. The sheer terror of the moment is palpable in the video. He did not say a word. He simply lowered his camera, turned it off, and walked out of the Horton mine as fast as he possibly can. He did not look back. When Frank got back to his house, he uploaded the raw, unedited footage of the swinging chain to his YouTube channel. He did not write a sensational title, and he did not claim to have seen a ghost. He simply titled it After the Mine and left a brief description saying this was what he had encountered. For the first year, the video sat on his channel with very little activity, just like his other 300 videos. But then, in 2014, the YouTube algorithm picked it up and the video went absolutely viral. Within weeks, it had millions of views. Paranormal researchers, television producers, and skeptics from all over the world were analyzing the footage frame by frame. The consensus among experts who analyzed the video was that the footage itself was completely authentic. There was no digital editing, no green screens, and no CGI. Frank had genuinely filmed a heavy metal chain swinging violently in a completely still, abandoned mine. This led to a massive, ongoing debate that continues to this day. Many people believe that Frank staged the entire thing as a hoax to get famous. They point to the fact that after this video went viral, Frank's channel exploded, and he began uploading videos that were specifically geared toward finding ghosts and paranormal activity, rather than his historical mine explorations. But supporters of Frank argue that he had no reason to fake the video. When he uploaded it, he had been diligently making videos for 5 years with zero financial return or recognition. He had no way of predicting that this one video would suddenly go viral a year later. Furthermore, if he wanted to stage a hoax, he likely would have made a much bigger deal out of it at the time, rather than just quietly uploading it with no commentary. As for Frank, he has always maintained that the video is 100% real. He had stated that he did not swing the chain and that he has no idea what caused it to move. The experience in the Horton mine terrified him so deeply that he refused to go back inside. Whether you believe the swinging chain was a ghost, a clever hoax, or some strange natural phenomenon, the footage remains one of the most famous and unsettling mysteries on the internet. Now, we are going to leave the desolate deserts of Nevada and head to a beautiful, historic town in Europe, where a celebration on a river would quickly turn into an absolute nightmare. The town of Sevnica is a gorgeous, picturesque community located in the heart of Slovenia. It is situated right along the banks of the Sava River, which is one of the longest and most scenic rivers in Europe. For decades, this specific section of the Sava River was a paradise for outdoor enthusiasts. Kayakers, canoeists, and rafters from all over the region would travel to Sevnica to spend their weekends paddling down the calm, pristine waters. But in 2008, that era was coming to an end. A massive hydroelectric dam was being constructed directly across the Sava River near Sevnica. Once completed, the dam would completely block the river from bank to bank, creating a permanent barrier that would make it impossible for boats to travel downstream without stopping, pulling their watercraft out of the water, and carrying them around the massive concrete structure. The mayor of Sevnica, a man who was a strong supporter of the dam because of the clean energy it would provide for his town, understood that many local residents were sad to see the river blocked. He wanted to organize an event that would serve as both a celebration of the town's future and a final tribute to the river's past. He decided to organize a final, historic trip down the Sava River, passing through the construction site of the dam before the gates were closed forever. He called this event the Final Descent. The mayor went all around town, personally inviting local politicians, community leaders, and business owners to join him on this historic journey. He eventually recruited 27 people to participate, making a total of 28 travelers. On July 3, 2008, the group gathered at a launching area a few miles upstream from the dam. The weather was absolutely perfect. The sun was shining, the sky was clear, and the Sava River was incredibly calm, looking more like a quiet lake than a moving river. The staff members who had provided the 4 large, professional-grade canoes for the trip offered life jackets to everyone in the group. But to the staff's surprise, virtually everyone, including the mayor, declined to wear them. It is not entirely clear why they made this decision, but it is likely because the river looked so incredibly peaceful and the trip was only supposed to take about 30 minutes. They saw it as a casual, low-risk float rather than a dangerous expedition. All 28 people climbed into the 4 canoes with exactly 7 people in each boat. They pushed off from the shore, laughing and talking, and began their slow journey downstream. The mayor had also hired a professional photographer to join them in one of the canoes to document the entire historic event, and the photographer was busy snapping pictures of the smiling faces. About 15 minutes into the trip, the canoes rounded a bend in the river, and the massive concrete structure of the partially finished dam came into view about 1,000 feet ahead. The dam was not yet fully operational, but the main concrete wall and the large flow gates were completely built. As they got closer, the group realized they had a major problem. The mayor had previously told everyone that there would be a wide, safe channel on the far left side of the dam that had not yet been blocked off by construction. He assured them they could easily paddle through this side channel, completely avoiding the main structure of the dam. But as they looked ahead, they could clearly see that the left channel was completely blocked. There was no way around. If they wanted to continue downstream, they would either have to pull their canoes out of the water and walk around, or they would have to go directly through the open concrete gates of the dam itself. The current of the river was extremely slow and weak, so there was no immediate danger of the canoes being swept over the dam against their will. They had plenty of time to make a decision. The most logical and safe choice would have been to paddle to the riverbank, get out, and call off the trip. But the mayor and several others in the lead canoes had a different idea. They looked at the concrete gates of the dam. The water was flowing over a relatively low 15-foot concrete slope, creating a small churning rapid at the bottom. To the mayor and some of the more adventurous members of the group, it did not look dangerous at all. In fact, it looked like a fun, thrilling slide. They thought it would be the perfect, exciting way to end their final descent. The construction crew working on the dam had explicitly warned the mayor weeks earlier that under no circumstances should anyone attempt to go over the dam, as the waters below were incredibly turbulent and dangerous. But the mayor brushed these warnings aside. He was confident in his paddling skills, and he managed to convince the occupants of 2 other canoes to join him. The occupants of the 4th canoe, which included the photographer, were not comfortable with the idea of going over the dam. They decided they would paddle to the left bank, get out of their canoe, and walk down to a safe viewing area. From there, the photographer could film and take pictures of the other 3 canoes as they made their thrilling slide down the dam. The photographer set up his camera on the riverbank and began filming as the first canoe, carrying the mayor and 6 others, lined up with one of the open dam gates. The video, which was later released to the public, is incredibly haunting. It shows the 7 people in the first canoe smiling, laughing, and waving at the camera. They look like they are on an amusement park ride. The canoe slowly enters the concrete channel of the dam and begins to tip forward as it hits the slope. As the canoe slides down the concrete ramp into the foaming white water below, someone in the boat lets out a loud, excited scream. But then, the moment the front of the canoe hits the water at the bottom of the slide, the boat instantly flips over, dumping all 7 people into the churning water. The video suddenly cuts to black. What the spectators on the shore did not realize was that the water at the base of the dam was not just a normal rapid. Because this was a hydroelectric dam, there were massive underwater intake tunnels located directly beneath the surface where the water was churning. These tunnels acted like giant underwater vacuums, sucking in thousands of gallons of water per second to spin the heavy turbines that generated electricity. Even though the dam was not fully operational yet, the water was still flowing through these intake tunnels under immense pressure. The moment the 7 people from the first canoe were thrown into the water, they were instantly sucked down into the dark underwater tunnels. They did not even have time to swim to the surface. Meanwhile, the second canoe, which was following closely behind, went over the dam before anyone on shore could warn them. They hit the same turbulent water, capsized instantly, and all 7 occupants were dragged down into the underwater vacuums. The third canoe went over the dam next. By some miracle, this boat managed to stay upright as it hit the water below. The 7 people on board looked around, expecting to see their friends in the other 2 canoes celebrating. But the water in front of them was completely empty. Then they saw a horrifying sight. One of the canoes was floating upside down in the foam, and the other had been completely shattered into pieces by the violent force of the water. The occupants of the third canoe immediately began paddling toward the base of the dam, desperately searching for survivors. But there was no one to rescue. The 14 people from the first 2 canoes had completely vanished beneath the surface. An intensive multi-day rescue operation was launched, involving police divers, helicopters, and search teams from both Slovenia and neighboring Croatia. Ultimately, 13 of the 14 people who had fallen into the water that day lost their lives. Among the dead was the mayor of Sevnica. The only survivor from those 2 canoes was the mayor's wife. By some absolute miracle, when she was thrown into the water, she managed to fight the powerful downward current, avoid being sucked into the intake tunnels, and swim to the safety of the riverbank. Over the next few weeks, search teams recovered the bodies of the 13 victims. The force of the underwater current was so powerful that one of the bodies was found 25 miles downstream, having been carried all the way across the border into Croatia. The tragedy of the final descent shocked the nation of Slovenia and served as a grim, horrifying reminder of the hidden, lethal power of hydroelectric structures. Now we are going to travel to the far northern reaches of Canada to a massive, wild valley that is so incredibly hostile and mysterious that it is known to the world as the Valley of the Headless Men. The Northwest Territories of Canada is one of the most desolate, uninhabited places on Earth. To put its size into perspective, it is 4 times larger than the entire country of Germany, yet it has a total population of only about 50,000 people. Almost the entire territory is pure, untouched wilderness filled with towering mountain ranges, endless forests, massive rivers, and incredibly dangerous predators. Within this wild territory sits an 11,000 square mile area known as the Nahani Valley. In 1976, the Canadian government turned the valley into a national park, but this is not a park for casual tourists. There are no roads leading into the Nahani Valley, no visitor centers, and no hotels. The only way to get inside is by chartering a bush plane, taking a highly dangerous boat trip up the rapids, or embarking on an incredibly grueling, multi-week overland hike, but the physical dangers of the valley are only part of its dark reputation. For centuries, the Nahani Valley has been said to be cursed. Local indigenous tribes have passed down stories of the Naha, a mysterious tribe that once lived in the valley and then suddenly vanished overnight without a trace, leaving all of their shelters and tools behind. Other tribes who tried to settle in the valley fled in terror, claiming they were being hunted by giant, hairy white giants and massive, prehistoric wolves they called wahilas. While these stories might sound like simple folklore, starting in the early 20th century, a series of real, documented events occurred in the Nahani Valley that were so terrifying they seemed to confirm the ancient legends. In 1904, three brothers named Willie, Frank, and Charlie Mloud decided they were going to brave the rumors and enter the Nahani Valley to prospect for gold. They believed that because the valley was so isolated and feared, no one had ever properly searched it for minerals. The brothers embarked on a grueling journey using dog sleds, pack horses, and eventually building a crude wooden boat to travel up the Flat River, which runs through the center of the valley. After weeks of traveling, they set up a camp along the riverbank and began using wooden gold sluices to sift through the river gravel. To their absolute amazement, they hit pay dirt almost immediately. The riverbed was absolutely loaded with gold. Within weeks, they had filled multiple heavy canvas bags with gold nuggets. They packed up their camp and began the dangerous boat trip back down the river, planning to sell their gold, buy better equipment, and return. But as they were navigating a set of violent rapids on the Flat River, their homemade boat hit a rock, capsized, and broke completely apart. All of their heavy gold bags sank to the bottom of the deep river, along with most of their supplies. The three brothers managed to swim to shore, cold, wet, and completely empty-handed. Using the few tools they had saved, they built a second cruder boat and returned to their gold site. But this time, they found absolutely nothing. Frustrated and exhausted, they returned home to regroup. Charlie, the oldest brother, decided he had had enough of the dangerous valley and refused to go back. But Willie and Frank were determined to get their fortune. In 1905, they recruited a friend named Robert Ware to replace Charlie, and the three men headed back into the Nahani Valley. They did not tell anyone exactly where they were going or when they planned to return. 2 full years passed, and no one heard a single word from the three men. Charlie Mloud eventually became deeply concerned. In 1907, he put together a search party of 4 experienced outdoorsmen and headed back into the valley to find his brothers. They traveled up the Flat River and then turned onto the South Nahani River, scanning the thick forests on both sides for any sign of a campfire or a campsite. They eventually entered a terrifying 10-mile stretch of the river known as the Second Canyon. This canyon is a truly foreboding place. The sheer rock cliffs on both sides of the river shoot straight up 3,000 feet into the air, completely blocking out the sun and keeping the canyon in a state of perpetual gloom. The water below is incredibly deep and cold, and high up on the cliff faces are the dark openings of massive unexplored cave systems. As the search party slowly paddled through the quiet, windy canyon, they noticed a small clearing in the trees on the left bank, right near the exit of the canyon. Tucked away in the spruce trees was a weathered canvas tent. Charlie and the search party quickly paddled to the shore and jumped out. But as they approached the tent, they stopped in horror. Lying on the ground directly outside the tent was a human skeleton. The clothes on the skeleton were completely charred and burned, and the bones were scattered. But the most horrifying detail was that the skull was completely missing. The right arm of the skeleton was stretched out, pointing toward a loaded rifle that was propped up against a nearby tree. Charlie ran toward the back of the tent, where the entrance was. Hanging halfway out of the sleeping bag inside the tent was a second skeleton. This body, too, was completely missing its head. Through personal items and clothing left in the tent, Charlie was able to identify the 2 headless bodies as his brothers Willie and Frank. The third man, Robert Weir, was nowhere to be found, although a partial, unidentified skeleton was discovered miles downstream several months later. The search party looked everywhere for the missing skulls, but they were never found. The only other clue was a crude carving on a nearby tree that read, "We have found a fine prospect." But there was no gold anywhere in the camp. The Northwest Mounted Police launched an investigation, but they ultimately ruled that the men had simply frozen or starved to death during the winter, and that wild animals had dragged away their heads. But the public did not buy this explanation. How could animals perfectly remove the heads of 2 men, leaving the rest of their skeletons intact inside their sleeping bags, while also burning the clothes of one of the victims? Rumors began to spread that a mysterious, bloodthirsty killer was living in the valley, or that the indigenous legends of evil spirits were true. From that point on, the Second Canyon was renamed the Headless Valley. Despite the terrifying deaths of the Mloud brothers, the lure of gold was too strong for some. In 1913, a Swedish gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen entered the Nahani Valley alone. He was determined to find the gold that had cost the Mloud brothers their lives. Martin traveled deep into the valley, built a small, sturdy log cabin, and began mining. He actually managed to send a letter out of the valley with a passing trapper, claiming he had struck a massive vein of gold and was incredibly rich. The following summer, Martin's business partners traveled into the valley to meet up with him at his cabin. But when they arrived, they found a scene of absolute devastation. The log cabin had been completely burned to the ground. Lying in the ashes next to the ruined cabin was the skeletal remains of Martin Jorgensen. Just like the Loud brothers, Martin's skeleton was completely intact, except for one thing. His head was gone, the police investigated, but once again they ruled it an accident, claiming his cabin had caught fire and animals had taken his skull. Once again, there was no gold found anywhere on the property. In 1921, another prospector named John O'Brien and his partner entered the Headless Valley. John went out one morning to check his animal traps along the river, promising to return in a few days. When he did not return, his partner went looking for him. They found John sitting upright on a log in front of a dead campfire. He was completely frozen to death, but he did not look like someone who had died of hypothermia. He was sitting completely relaxed, holding a matchbook in his hand, with a peaceful expression on his face. It looked as though he had been instantaneously flash frozen in a matter of seconds before he even had time to react to the cold. In 1926, a hunting party was camping in the Headless Valley. In the middle of the night, a young woman in the party named Annie Lafferty went missing from her tent. The group searched for days, but found no trace of her. Months later, a lone trapper who had been in the area that same night came forward to the police with a terrifying story. He said that on the night Annie disappeared, he was sleeping by the river when he heard the sound of rocks falling down a steep cliff face. He sat up, looked across the river in the moonlight, and saw a naked white woman running on all fours like an animal up the sheer rocky cliff. He said she briefly turned her head, and her face looked completely possessed and inhuman. In 1931, a prospector named Phil Powers went into the valley. His cabin was later found burned to the ground with his charred, headless remains inside. In 1936, two prospectors named William Epper and Joseph Holland vanished, and their cabin was found burned. In 1945, a miner named Ernest Sabard was found decapitated inside his sleeping bag. To this day, over 40 people have gone missing or died mysterious, violent deaths inside the Nahani Valley, many of them found decapitated. While the Canadian government has closed off large sections of the park to the public, claiming it is for environmental protection, many locals believe they are trying to keep people away from whatever evil force is lurking in the Headless Valley. Now, we are going to leave the freezing, haunted valleys of Canada and travel to a place that is supposed to be the happiest place on Earth, but where a young girl would meet a truly horrific, agonizing end. In 1974, an 18-year-old college student named Debbie Stone landed what she believed was the absolute perfect summer job. She was hired to work as a hostess at the newly opened Disneyland theme park in Anaheim, California. Debbie was assigned to work at a brand new, highly anticipated attraction called America Sings. The attraction was incredibly advanced for its time. Disney had taken a massive rotating circular building, similar to a carousel, and divided it into 6 different stages. Each of these 6 stages featured an elaborate set filled with state-of-the-art animatronic characters, mostly robotic animals that would sing classic American songs. The audience would walk into a stationary theater, sit down, and watch the first stage perform. Once the 2-minute performance was over, the entire outer ring of the building, which contained the stages and the heavy partition walls separating them, would rotate. This would bring the second stage in front of the audience. While the first stage rotated out of view to perform for a different theater of people, Debbie's job as a hostess was to stand on the stage before the show started, welcome the audience, and give a brief safety presentation. Once the presentation was over, she would step off the stage, the show would begin, and the stages would start rotating. At the end of the show, she would step back onto the stage, say goodbye to the guests, and guide them toward the exit. It was a simple, easy job, and Debbie loved the fun, energetic atmosphere of the park. On July 9, 1974, just 9 days after the attraction had officially opened to the public, Debbie was scheduled to work the late-night shift. At around 10 o'clock that evening, a new group of guests filed into the theater. Debbie walked out onto the stage, gave her standard welcoming speech with a bright, warm smile, and then stepped back into the shadows as the lights dimmed and the first act began. Over the next 30 minutes, the show ran perfectly, the massive stages rotating smoothly from one act to the next. At the end of the final act, Debbie stepped back onto the stage, thanked the guests, and wished them a magical night as they exited the theater. As the guests were filing out, Debbie began walking toward the back of the stage she was standing on, intending to cross over to the adjacent stage to prepare for the next incoming group of visitors. But what Debbie did not realize was that the physical design of the America Sings attraction had a fatal, catastrophic flaw. In the very center of the rotating outer ring of stages was a large, circular storage room. This central room was completely stationary, meaning it did not move. The outer ring of stages, along with the massive, heavy concrete partition walls that separated each stage, rotated directly around this stationary central room. The gap between the moving partition walls of the stages and the stationary central wall was incredibly narrow, only about a couple of inches wide. It was a massive pinch point, a physical hazard where anything caught in between would be subjected to the immense mechanical force of the rotating machinery. Yet, because the attraction was brand new, Disney had not yet installed any safety grates, sensors, or warning lights to prevent employees from stepping into this dangerous area. They had simply told the staff to be careful. As Debbie was walking toward the back of the stage in the dim light, she either tripped, lost her balance, or simply misjudged her footing. She fell backward, sliding directly into the narrow gap between the moving stage wall and the stationary central wall. She was instantly wedged tight, unable to pull herself out. Terrified, she began to scream at the top of her lungs for help. But the timing could not have been worse. The next show was about to start. A new crowd of excited, noisy tourists was filing into the theater, talking and laughing loudly. At the same time, the loud, cheerful theme music of the attraction began to blast from the speakers. Debbie's desperate screams for help were completely drowned out by the music and the crowd. Some guests in the front row did hear a faint, muffled screaming coming from behind the stage walls, but they assumed it was just a recording or a sound effect that was part of the show. Then, the massive electric motors of the attraction kicked in, and the outer ring of stages began to rotate. As the heavy concrete wall of the stage began to move past the stationary central wall, Debbie was caught in the pinch point. The immense mechanical force began to slowly drag, twist, and roll her body through the 2-inch gap. The agony must have been absolutely unimaginable. Her bones began to snap, and her internal organs were crushed as she was forcibly squeezed through the narrow space. Yet, the machinery was so powerful that it did not stall. It simply kept rotating, dragging her broken body along with it until the stage reached its next position and stopped. Astonishingly, Debbie did not die instantly. She was trapped in the darkness behind the animatronic sets, suffering from catastrophic, life-threatening injuries, and she was still screaming for help with whatever strength she had left. But once again, the next act of the show began. The loud robotic animals began to sing, and her screams were ignored. A few minutes later, the show transitioned, and the stage rotated once again, subjecting Debbie to another round of horrific, crushing forces. This cycle repeated for the entire duration of the 30-minute show. Finally, at the end of the presentation, a guest who had been sitting in the front row and was deeply disturbed by the persistent, muffled screaming went up to a ride operator and insisted that someone was hurt behind the stage. The operator stopped the ride, went into the central area to investigate, and discovered Debbie's body. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The tragic and horrifying death of Debbie Stone led to a massive investigation by OSHA. Disney was forced to pay a small settlement to her family, and the America Sings attraction was closed for several days while engineers installed safety sensors and physical barriers to ensure that no one could ever access the dangerous gap again. The attraction eventually reopened, but the memory of that horrific night lingered, and the ride was permanently closed in 1988. Now, we are going to travel across the Pacific Ocean to a beautiful mountain range in Japan, where a massive rescue operation would uncover a chilling message left by a dying man and a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. The island of Hokkaido is the northernmost of Japan's 4 major islands. It is a place of wild, rugged beauty, filled with active volcanoes, deep forests, and stunning national parks. The largest and most famous of these parks is Daisetsuzan, which translates to the playground of the gods. The park is dominated by Mount Asahideke, a massive, active volcano that stands over 7,500 feet tall. It is an incredibly popular destination for hikers and mountain climbers who travel from all over the world to conquer its summit. The main trail leading up the mountain is generally considered to be quite safe and straightforward. However, there is one specific section near the top that is notorious for confusing hikers. As you climb higher up the mountain, the trees and vegetation completely disappear, replaced by a barren, open landscape of loose volcanic rock and frequent heavy fog. In poor weather, the trail becomes almost impossible to see. To help hikers stay on track, park rangers advise them to look for a specific landmark near the top of the ridge. This landmark is a massive, perfectly square boulder known as Safe Rock. Once hikers reach Safe Rock, they are supposed to make a sharp turn, which puts them on the final, easy path to the summit, but the problem is there is a second, almost identical square boulder located just a short distance away from the real one. This second boulder is known to rangers as False Safe Rock. If a hiker accidentally mistakes False Safe Rock for the real landmark and takes the trail leading away from it, they will be led down a steep, unmarked path that heads in the completely wrong direction. At first, the path seems fine, but as it continues, it begins to descend into a steep, rugged valley. Because many hikers are first-timers who are confident they followed the instructions, they often ignore the red flag of the descending trail and keep walking, believing the path will eventually loop back up to the summit. But it does not. If you continue down this wrong path for about a mile, you will find yourself trapped in a deep, swampy valley that is completely overgrown with thick, towering bamboo. The bamboo is so tall and dense that it completely blocks out the horizon, making it impossible to see where you are going. To make matters worse, the valley is filled with steep, hidden cliff drop-offs. Once you step into this bamboo forest, you are effectively blind, and it is incredibly easy to walk right off a cliff to your death. On July 21st, 1989, Two young men from Tokyo were hiking up Mount Asahidake when they became caught in a sudden thick fog. Disoriented, they mistook false safe rock for the real landmark, took the wrong turn, and quickly became hopelessly lost in the swampy bamboo valley. When they did not return to their lodge that evening, their families contacted the police, and a massive search and rescue operation was launched. Ground teams searched the lower slopes, while police helicopters flew over the mountain, scanning the barren ridges. For 3 days, there was absolutely no sign of the missing hikers. The searchers were beginning to fear the worst, but on the afternoon of July 24th, a police helicopter was flying over a remote, rocky southern slope of the mountain, an area far away from where they expected the hikers to be. The pilot rounded a steep ridge and looked down into a wide-open alpine clearing, and there, right in the middle of the clearing, he saw a shocking sight. Laid out on the ground were 3 massive, perfectly formed letters, SOS. The letters were so large they could easily be seen from thousands of feet in the air. The pilot immediately radioed the ground teams, giving them the exact coordinates of the distress signal, assuming the 2 missing Tokyo hikers were waiting nearby. A ground rescue team was dispatched to the coordinates, but as they were hiking toward the clearing, they spotted 2 exhausted, dehydrated men walking out of the thick bamboo brush about 2 miles north of the SOS sign. It was the 2 missing hikers from Tokyo. They were weak, hungry, and on the verge of collapse, but they were alive. The rescue helicopter picked them up, flew them to a local hospital, and within a few days, they were on their way to a full recovery. The helicopter pilot and several searchers went to the hospital to visit the men. During the conversation, the pilot praised the men for their quick thinking, telling them that the massive SOS sign they had built out of logs was the only reason they had been found. But the 2 hikers looked at the pilot in complete confusion. They said they had not built any SOS sign. In fact, they had never even entered that clearing. The searchers were stunned. If the 2 rescued hikers had not built the sign, it meant there was someone else trapped on the mountain, someone who was in desperate need of help. The very next morning, a large search team returned to the clearing where the SOS sign was located. When they examined the letters up close, they realized the sign was a work of incredible Herculean effort. The letters were constructed out of 19 massive, heavy logs of white birch. Each letter was 16 feet tall and 10 feet wide. The logs had been neatly and cleanly cut, and they had been dragged from a forest of birch trees located several hundred yards away. As the searchers began scouring the surrounding forest, they found a deep hole located underneath the roots of a massive tree, just a short distance from the clearing. Inside the hole was a weathered backpack. Inside the backpack, police found a driver's license belonging to a 25-year-old man named Kenji Iwamura, who had gone missing on the mountain 5 years earlier in 1984. They also found a small battery-powered audio cassette recorder. One of the officers pressed the play button on the recorder. What came out of the speaker was a voice that sent a chill straight down the spines of everyone present. It was the voice of a young man, panting heavily, his voice trembling with absolute panic and despair. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, desperately calling out into the empty wilderness. The voice, which was later confirmed to be Kenji's, screamed in Japanese, asking for help, saying he was trapped on a cliff, that the bamboo was too thick, and that he could not move. He begged the listener to lift him up from this place. The recording was incredibly short, only about 2 minutes long, and it ended with the sound of the wind howling and the tape clicking off. It was clear that Kenji had recorded his final desperate thoughts, hoping that if he died, someone would find the recorder and know what had happened to him. Based on the discovery of the backpack and the recording, the police reconstructed Kenji's final days. In 1984, Kenji had taken the wrong turn at False Safe Rock and gotten lost in the Bamboo Valley. He had wandered for days, eventually becoming trapped on a narrow cliff ledge. He had heard a search helicopter flying overhead, but because of the thick bamboo canopy, the helicopter crew had not seen him. In a fit of panic and desperation, Kenji had recorded the message on his tape recorder. But then he decided he could not just sit on the ledge and die. He made a desperate, highly dangerous attempt to climb down the sheer cliff. By some miracle, he survived the climb, reached the clearing below, and spent his remaining energy cutting down 19 massive birch trees to build the giant SOS sign. A few hours after finding the backpack, searchers located a scattered, partial human skeleton in the thick brush nearby. The bones were confirmed to be the remains of Kenji Iwamura. The case was officially closed, and the mystery was seemingly solved, but to the public and the media who followed the case, there was a massive, glaring problem with the police's explanation. The 19 logs used to build the SOS sign were incredibly heavy, some of them weighing over 100 pounds. They had been cut with clean, precise angles, indicating they had been chopped down with a heavy steel axe or a large saw. But when the police searched the entire clearing, the forest, the backpack, and the area where Kenji's bones were found, they found absolutely no tools. There was no axe, no saw, and no knife. Furthermore, the medical examiner who performed the autopsy on Kenji's skeletal remains stated that given his state of severe starvation and dehydration, Kenji would have been far too weak to chop down 19 massive trees and drag them hundreds of yards to build the sign. It would have been physically impossible for a single dying man to accomplish such a feat without any tools. This led to a terrifying theory that Kenji was not alone on the mountain. Many believe there was a second, unknown person with him, someone who possessed the strength and the tools to build the sign, but who was never found. To make the mystery even more unsettling, when Kenji's parents were played the audio recording, they stated that the voice on the tape did not sound like their son. While the police refused to reopen the case, the giant mysterious SOS sign on the slopes of Mount Asahideke remains one of Japan's most haunting and enduring wilderness mysteries. Now, we are going to close today's journey with a tragic, deeply unsettling story from the coast of Texas, where a simple, relaxing night of fishing would end in a highly unusual and terrifying accident. On Monday, May 23, 2005, a 37-year-old man named John Wilson arrived at his home in Houston, Texas, after an incredibly grueling day of work. John worked as an oil pipeline inspector, a job that required him to spend long, exhausting hours driving between various construction sites, walking through rough terrain, and standing out in the blistering Texas heat. On this particular day, the temperature had been in the high 90s, and John was completely wiped out. He walked into his living room and collapsed onto the sofa, feeling the physical toll of the long day. He knew he should probably just take a shower, eat some dinner, and go straight to bed. But John did not want his entire life to consist of just working and sleeping. He wanted to do something to unwind, to reclaim a piece of his day for himself before he had to get up and do it all over again. John was an avid outdoorsman, and his absolute favorite way to decompress was to go fishing. Usually, he did a lot of freshwater fishing in the local lakes and bayous around Houston. But on this warm night, he decided he wanted to do something different. He wanted to go saltwater fishing at around 7:30 in the evening. John got off the couch, grabbed his favorite saltwater fishing rod, packed up his tackle box, and threw them into the bed of his pickup truck. He climbed into the driver's seat and began the 90-minute drive south, heading toward the Gulf of Mexico. His destination was a place called Crystal Beach, which is located on the Bolivar Peninsula, just a short ferry ride away from Galveston. Crystal Beach was a highly popular spot for local fishermen because of a very unique feature. While most beaches have soft, powdery sand that will easily trap a vehicle, the sand at Crystal Beach was incredibly hard-packed, almost like concrete. Because of this, the local county allowed people to drive their vehicles directly out onto the actual beach, right up to the water's edge. John arrived at Crystal Beach around 9 o'clock at night. The beach was almost entirely empty, save for a few distant headlights of other night fishermen scattered miles down the coast. The tide was currently going out, heading toward low tide, which meant there was a wide, flat stretch of wet, hard-packed sand exposed. John drove his truck through the beach entrance, turned onto the sand, and drove down toward the surf. He parked his truck in the tidal zone, the area of the beach that is covered by water during high tide but exposed during low tide. Because high tide was not scheduled for several hours, John knew his truck was perfectly safe where it was. He was not planning to stay all night. He just wanted to fish for an hour or two and then head home. He hopped out of his truck, walked to the back, and grabbed his rod. He walked out into the warm, gentle surf of the Gulf of Mexico, cast his line into the dark water, and began to fish. For a long time, John stood in the water, enjoying the absolute peace and quiet. The only sound was the gentle crashing of the waves and the distant hum of the wind. It was exactly what he needed to wash away the stress of his workday. But as the hours ticked by, the physical exhaustion of his long day began to catch up with him. The repetitive motion of casting, combined with the gentle, rhythmic rocking of the ocean waves against his legs, made him incredibly drowsy. By around midnight, John realized he was far too tired to safely drive the 90 miles back to Houston. He decided he needed to take a short, quick nap to refresh himself before hitting the road. He walked back to his truck, placed his fishing rod in the truck bed, and looked around. He did not want to sleep in the cab of his truck because the interior was incredibly hot and stuffy. He wanted to sleep somewhere cool where he could feel the ocean breeze. He decided to crawl directly underneath his pickup truck. The underside of the truck provided the perfect shelter. It blocked the bright moonlight, protected him from any sudden drizzle, and the metal frame of the vehicle was cool to the touch. John lay down on the hard, cool sand beneath the engine block, closed his eyes, and instantly fell into a deep, heavy sleep. But John had made a fatal, tragic mistake. While the sand at Crystal Beach was famous for being hard-packed, it was still sand. When a heavy vehicle like a pickup truck sits stationary in one spot for hours, the gentle vibration of the ocean waves traveling through the ground causes the moisture in the sand to rise. This process, known as liquefaction, causes the solid sand to lose its strength and behave like a thick liquid. As John slept deeply, the tide slowly began to turn. The ocean water began to creep back up the beach, eventually reaching the tires of John's truck. The water saturated the sand beneath the heavy tires. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the heavy truck began to sink into the wet sand. The massive weight of the vehicle caused the chassis to settle lower and lower. pressing down into the sand. Because John was asleep directly beneath the center of the truck, he did not realize what was happening until it was too late. As the truck settled, the heavy metal oil pan and the exhaust system began to press directly into his chest and abdomen. When John finally woke up, he was completely pinned. He tried to squirm out from under the frame, but the truck had settled so low that there was only a few inches of clearance. The heavy metal was crushing his chest, making it impossible for him to take a deep breath or scream for help. And then the tide continued to come in. The cold ocean water began to wash under the truck, rising higher and higher around John's face. He was completely helpless, pinned to the sand by his own vehicle as the water slowly rose over his nose and mouth. The next morning, a local resident walking along Crystal Beach spotted a pickup truck half submerged in the deep surf. He called the police. Assuming someone had abandoned their vehicle after getting stuck in the tide, a tow truck was dispatched to the scene, but because the tide was still high, the driver had to wait several hours for the water to recede before he could safely hook up his chains. Once the water went down, the tow truck driver walked out to the truck to hook up the axle. He looked down beneath the chassis and his heart stopped. Poking out from beneath the sunken frame of the truck was the body of John Wilson. He had been crushed and drowned in the night, just inches away from his own driver's seat. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.